The slap echoed across the entire diner like a gunshot, and for one terrible moment, every fork stopped moving, every conversation died, and the world seemed to hold its breath. 17-year-old Cassandra had been minding her own business, sitting in her wheelchair near the window booth of Miller's Diner in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, her untouched hot chocolate growing cold beside her. She hadn't said a word to anyone. She never did. But that hadn't mattered to the group of boys who had been circling her table for the last 10 minutes, feeding off each other's cruelty the way fire feeds off dry wood, growing bigger and more dangerous with every passing second. And then one of them reached out and slapped her across the face, hard enough to snap her head sideways, hard enough to bring tears streaming down her cheeks before she even understood what had happened. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. The waitress behind the counter looked away. A man in a corner booth suddenly found something very interesting on his phone. An older couple near the door shifted uncomfortably in their seats but said nothing, did nothing. Cassandra sat alone in her humiliation, her brown hair falling across her reddened cheek, her hands trembling in her lap, and she did what she had learned to do in moments like this. She went somewhere else inside herself, somewhere quiet and far away where none of this could reach her. If you believe in kindness, in standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves, hit that like button right now, drop a comment below, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel, because stories like Cassandra's deserve to be told. Cassandra had been in that wheelchair since she was 9 years old. A drunk driver on Route 322 had taken everything from her in 3 seconds flat, her ability to walk, her sense of safety, and for a long time, her belief that the world contained more good people than bad ones. She lived with her grandmother, Ruth, a quiet woman with flour-dusted hands and a deep, abiding faith that God had not forgotten her granddaughter. Every Sunday, Ruth would press Cassandra's dress and will her to church, and every Sunday Cassandra would sit in the pew and wonder why, if God was watching, he so often seemed to be looking the other way. She had come to Miller's Diner alone that afternoon because Ruth had encouraged her. "Go be in the world, baby," the old woman had said, pressing 2 folded dollar bills into her granddaughter's palm. "The world needs to see your face." So Cassandra had wheeled herself 4 blocks through the November cold, ordered a hot chocolate with extra marshmallows, and tried to feel like a normal girl doing a normal thing on a normal Saturday afternoon. She had almost succeeded, right up until the moment a boy named Trevor, 17 and broad-shouldered with cold eyes that had never learned the meaning of consequence, decided that her existence in his general vicinity was some kind of personal offense. His friends had laughed when he flicked her scarf off her shoulder. They had laughed harder when he leaned down and said something vicious into her ear that made her flinch. And they had laughed loudest of all when his palm connected with her cheek and she cried without making a sound, because Cassandra had learned long ago that making a sound only made things worse. Trevor picked up her hot chocolate, looked at her with a smirk that contained not a single atom of remorse, and set it down on the far side of the table, just out of her reach. Then he and his friends took the booth behind her and ordered cheeseburgers like nothing had happened at all. The next hour was the loneliest of Cassandra's life, and that was saying something. She sat with her red cheek and her unreachable hot chocolate and her quiet tears, and she thought about Ruth, and she thought about the driver who had hit her, and she thought about all the people in this diner who had watched and decided that looking away was the same thing as being innocent. She thought about leaving, but the cold outside seemed as unkind as the warmth inside, and so she stayed, because sometimes you stay in a bad situation simply because you don't have the energy to find a worse one. She didn't hear the motorcycles pull up outside. She didn't notice the sound of heavy boots on the linoleum or the way the overhead bell above the door rang not once but multiple times in quick succession. She was still looking at her hands when she felt a shift in the room, a change in the air pressure, the way a room feels when something large and significant enters it. She looked up. 7 men stood inside the doorway of Miller's Diner, broad-shouldered and leather-clad, their vests covered in patches, their faces weathered by miles and years and hard-lived lives. They were members of the Iron Cross Brotherhood, a motorcycle club based out of central Pennsylvania, and they had stopped in for coffee and pie on their way back from a veterans fundraiser 2 towns over. Their president, a bald, barrel-chested man named Marcus, was the first one fully through the door, and he took in the scene in the diner the way a man trained to read situations reads them, quickly, completely, and without flinching. He saw the girl in the wheelchair. He saw the red mark on her cheek. He saw the untouched hot chocolate sitting just out of her reach, and he saw the group of boys in the booth behind her laughing at something on one of their phones. Marcus had a daughter of his own, 19 years old, studying nursing in Pittsburgh. He had a sister who had spent 3 years in a wheelchair after a riding accident. And he had spent 22 years in the United States Army learning precisely what it looked like when someone had been hurt and the people around them had decided not to care. He walked across the diner without saying a word to his crew, but they followed anyway, because that was what they did. He stopped at Cassandra's table, pulled out a chair, and sat down across from her at eye level, a small gesture, but one that meant everything. He reached across the table, picked up the hot chocolate, and set it gently right in front of her hands. Then he looked at her with the steady eyes of a man who had seen genuine suffering and never learned to look away from it, and he said, quietly enough that only she could hear, that she was not alone, and that nobody was going to bother her anymore today. Behind them, Trevor and his friends had gone very quiet. 2 of Marcus's crew had positioned themselves near that booth without being asked, arms folded, expressions carved from something harder than stone. They didn't threaten. They didn't need to. There is a particular kind of stillness that emanates from people who have lived through real things, who have stood in actual darkness, and that stillness communicates everything words cannot. Trevor looked at the backs of those leather vests and felt, perhaps for the first time in his pampered, consequence-free life, a cold and clarifying fear. He and his friends left their half-eaten cheeseburgers on the table and walked out the door without looking back. The diner exhaled. The waitress behind the counter, a middle-aged woman named Gloria who had been ashamed of herself for the past hour, walked over with a fresh hot chocolate, extra marshmallows, on the house, and set it down beside the first one, because she didn't know what else to do with the guilt that had been building in her chest since the moment she had looked away. The older couple by the door caught Cassandra's eye and offered her the kind of nod that tries to apologize for everything and succeeds at almost nothing, but means something anyway. The man in the corner booth put down his phone and stared at the table and sat with what he had done. Marcus and his crew stayed for 2 full hours. They ordered pie and coffee and talked to Cassandra like she was exactly who she was, a smart, funny, quietly extraordinary young woman with strong opinions about movies and a deep knowledge of Pennsylvania history that surprised all of them. A man named Hector, who had lost partial movement in his left hand to a roadside bomb in Fallujah, showed her his scars without being asked and told her that the body is just the vessel and the person inside it is the actual miracle. A younger member named Patrick, 26 and freckled and unexpectedly soft-spoken, told her that he had been bullied relentlessly in high school and that the thing that had saved him was one person choosing to sit beside him on the worst day. He told her that one person always matters. He told her that she mattered. When Cassandra finally wheeled herself home that evening, the November cold didn't feel quite so sharp. Ruth was standing at the front window watching for her, the way she always did, and when she saw her granddaughter's face, tear-stained but something else too, something lit from the inside, she opened the door before Cassandra even reached the porch. Cassandra told her grandmother everything, and Ruth stood in the doorway of their small house with her flour-dusted hands pressed together and her eyes closed, and she said thank you to something or someone that only she could see. The following week, Marcus and 2 members of the Iron Cross Brotherhood returned to Harrisburg. They had made a few calls, spoken to a few people, and arranged for Trevor and his friends to face a formal meeting with the school board and a mandatory community service program with the city's Disability Outreach Center. They also presented Cassandra with a handwritten letter, signed by all 7 of them, that said simply, "You deserved better from every person in that diner that day. We're sorry we weren't there sooner. The world needs you in it." Cassandra framed that letter and hung it above her desk, where she could see it every morning when she opened her eyes. Comment the word kindness below if this story moved you, if it reminded you that one person can change everything, and that showing up for someone who is struggling is the most powerful thing a human being can do. Some stories don't have heroes in capes. Sometimes they have leather vests and motorcycle boots and eyes that have seen enough of the world's darkness to recognize its light. Sometimes the people who show up for you are the ones nobody expected, and sometimes all it takes is one table, one cup of hot chocolate moved back within reach, and one person willing to sit down and say, "I see you, and you are not alone." If this story touched your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that kindness still exists, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story that matters. Every share is another person reminded that one act of courage can change a life forever.